Our guest tonight is Gil Barndollar of Defense Priorities. He is a fellow there, a senior research fellow at the Catholic University of America's Center for the Study of Statesmanship. From 2009 to 2016, he served as an infantry officer in the United States Marine Corps, going to Afghanistan twice, to Guantanamo Bay, and to the Persian Gulf. He has an AB in history from Bowdoin and an MPhil and PhD in history from the University of Cambridge. And we're going to be talking tonight about the U.S. global force posture, the recent Pentagon Global Force Posture Review and its results, and where we ought to be going with our global force posture. So, Gil, if you could lay out for us just a bit what our current global force posture looks like.
Yeah, let me just speak kind of in the broadest possible terms, and I should say thanks for having me here tonight. It's always a pleasure to talk to John Quincy Adams Society members, and I think, spread whatever you want to call that, realist or restraint or spread I think a welcome kind of counter to some of the prevailing foreign policy orthodoxies in Washington, which I think are less secure, less ironclad than maybe they used to be. So yeah, speaking broadly, the United States has about, at any given time, about 250,000 troops overseas, spread throughout the globe, and everything ranging from, small kind of coordination cells or what are sometimes called lily pads, very small expeditionary bases, usually to facilitate logistics or the training of foreign troops. Usually a lot of that is counterterrorism linked, although not necessarily, all the way up to, massive, essentially small cities, kind of little Americas abroad, most of which are long-term enduring bases that date back to the Cold War, to places like Germany, Japan, some of the and not always defeated nations, but some of our closest partners and countries we view as kind of strategic key hubs in important regions. So again, call it give or take 250,000 troops at any given time, and those numbers fluctuate. And that's setting aside, big chunks of the Navy that are not stationed forward, as in Japan or places like that, but obviously have rotational deployments. That goes for the other services too, but the Navy's the most important and visible of those elements in terms of U.S. ships operating far from their home ports on the east coast or the west coast or Hawaii or wherever. The base count, I take those numbers with a grain of salt. I think they're both under and over counts. It's certainly in the hundreds of total U.S. installations overseas. Some of the bigger recent studies have been, I think, rightly sort of attacked for overcounting, for including tons of tiny little things as bases that are actually really just buildings or substations. There's some, if you want to dig into that, there's back and forth on that in a lot of open source online venues. By the same token, there are undoubtedly things that are off the books that are, again, generally, although not always, kind of counterterrorism and Joint Special Operations Command aligned kind of stuff that may not be in any kind of public audit. So I've never seen a number that struck me as something I had 100% clarity in unclassified sources, but call it ballpark, 250,000 troops, heavy presence, especially in Asia and Europe, but also in the Middle East, and hundreds of installations of ranging dramatically in size.
Yeah, and so that's the baseline that we're starting from. Recently, the Biden administration launched a review of this called the Global Posture Review, which wasn't the first time DoD had reviewed its posture abroad. And the stated purpose of this Global Posture Review, which gave its results maybe 2 months ago or a month ago at this point, is to ensure that our military footprint is appropriately aligned with our foreign policy and national security priorities. So what was the result of that process? What did the GPR conclude?
Yeah, the GPR, I think, was universally regarded as a disappointment. I mean, any kind of defense analyst you read or Pentagon watcher, everyone that's spoken publicly on it, myself included, it was at a minimum kind of disappointed or nonplussed by its recommendations, all the way to some folks that I think were even more put out and viewed it as a really, maybe an important missed opportunity. But yeah, there are a couple of pieces to that. One, this was something that was tasked very early on in the administration. I think it was mid-February of 2021, when shortly after the administration came into office, before the Afghanistan withdrawal, before some of the other bigger foreign policy events of the past year, the Secretary of Defense was tasked by the president with conducting a global posture review of all U.S. forces and installations to ensure that America's military presence overseas is aligned with American strategy. Of course, this was rightly, some people pointed out more after the fact than during the GPR, but there is a question of why, and I haven't heard a satisfactory answer on that in terms of the timing or the sequencing here, in the sense that the global posture review should proceed from strategy, right? And the Biden administration came in, it owes its national security strategy, national defense strategy, and national military strategy, all kind of going downstream. Those are all due this year. In the interim, the Biden administration published its interim national security guidance. That actually came out after the GPR, I think, by roughly contemporary. But there's definitely a kind of cart and horse dynamic here, in terms of you are, you're doing your posture after, before you lay out what your strategy is supposed to be. So that's one argument that I think has a lot of salience. But regardless, the GPR went forward, took a lot longer than planned. There was talk of, I think initially they had it set for May or June of 2021. That got kicked into the fall, and then eventually it was a very quiet release in December. And not only was it released sort of long after it had been expected for whatever bureaucratic or internal reasons, but the entire thing was effectively classified. The Pentagon released what I think probably, if you print it out, as a 1.5-page, 2-page readout. And that was about it. And then, trotted out some officials and at sort of the assistant secretary level to speak to this on the record at think tank events and with the press. But what it amounted to, and I said this somewhere else a couple of weeks ago, the Pentagon essentially graded itself and gave itself an A, or maybe an A minus. There were some very minor tweaks, kind of a division artillery headquarters and a helicopter squadron to Korea, some limited changes to force posture in Australia, sort of a halt to the kind of belated Trump administration withdrawal of a chunk of the footprint in Germany, but very minor stuff. So essentially, the Pentagon wrote out this report, didn't release it really, released, as I said, a really minor kind of summary of what was in there, and then said, hey, we're pretty much doing what we should be doing. I think Pacific would look at this, as I said, across the spectrum, and people like myself, or maybe more in between there, look at this and think, really, given both the foreign policy and military, I would say, kind of slow motion disasters of the past 2 decades, given both that, and also given how much of U.S. military force posture is a hangover from not just kind of pre-September 11th or the post-September 11th counterterrorism era, but even more so, how much of it is a hangover from the Cold War, which we're now, 30 years past and then some. So it's really hard to look at that, I think, to me, to look at that and look at the world we're in, and how much our position in the world has changed since the Cold War, since September 11th, and then in some ways even more so in the past kind of half decade, as the challenge confronting the United States, probably not primarily a military challenge, but the challenge confronting the United States in Asia from China is now front and center. So you look at all that and this sort of legacy global posture, I find it very hard to believe that is how we should be doing business.
Yeah, I mean, I think just to manifest how big that legacy element there is, you mentioned Little Americas Abroad, and when I was a teenager, I lived on one of those, Yongsan Garrison in Korea. And if you go there now, it's built right in the middle of the city in Seoul, and it's you could kind of see some of the sources of friction with the local population, because there were helicopters flying in and out next to 20-story apartment buildings right outside people's windows. And I had a yard where I lived, and there's 20-story apartment buildings again 200 yards away, and it was a base that was built decades ago, way before Seoul was that big, was a city of more than 10 million people. And, times had changed, and they have started moving that base a lot. But, it really did show like, wow, this was very old. I mean, they had buildings that were there from the Japanese administration that they had taken over, that we had taken over when we arrived after the partition of Korea. But moving over to Europe, the headlines lately have been talking about a lot about the prospect of a Russian invasion of Ukraine. And in your writing on the Global Posture Review and on what our force posture ought to be abroad, you've suggested that the United States doesn't need as many forces in Europe as we currently have. Explain your reasoning? Because I think a lot of folks are sitting and looking at the situation in Europe and saying, well, wow, there's all this tension. Shouldn't we be putting forces in?
Yeah, I mean, this is we are where we are at this moment, and I don't know. It seems to me, and I'm following the situation to some degree, not super closely in terms of maybe the day by day, but I have a pretty good idea broadly of what's going on. And there's probably a better than 50-50 chance, give or take a coin flip, of a war breaking out in Ukraine. The Russians going in pretty substantial force with some pretty big political goals. I think the betting is that this is getting more and more likely, not less. It doesn't mean it's a done deal, and there are all kinds of potential stand downs or kind of negotiated solutions here that are in the realm of the possible, maybe. But it's certainly a much more fraught and combustible situation than it was even a couple months ago, let alone a couple of years ago. So sure, we are where we are. I would say there's kind of a long and a short-term component to this. One, the big mistakes were made a long time ago. I mean, I'm in the camp of people that think that NATO expansion was a mistake. It certainly in the way it went down. There's a long back and forth, and you can read plenty of stuff about who promised what to whom, and what was really on paper and what wasn't, in terms of the state of a shattered USSR that had become a very weak and temporarily militarily impotent Russian Federation in the early years after the Cold War. But regardless, we, in some ways, taking nothing away from element of Russian revanchism, of Russian paranoia, of what Russia's done in its near abroad, never mind within some borders. You can acknowledge all that and say the United States, I think, bears a heavy share of the blame for the situation we now find ourselves in, and that's been a slow-moving thing. But hand in hand with that is the fact that we allowed and enabled continuing with the security architecture of the Cold War, essentially, we enabled Europe to be more and more militarily impotent, even as we kept ourselves kind of involved in European security problems. And there have been multiple, the kind of warnings and indicators of this for a long time coming, and they've all been sort of brushed past. You look at the Balkan Wars, which took a long time to. Europeans were not going to resolve that. The United States finally stepped in, rightly or wrongly. And James Baker famously said when he was Secretary of State, "We don't have a dog in this fight." But the United States eventually did go in and help bring both the Bosnian War and then the Kosovo War to a conclusion. Arguably saved a lot of lives. Those are, I think, still probably rightly seen as frozen conflicts in some form. And Bosnia may be heating up, and there have been some indications that way in the last few months. But there's a long-winded way of coming around and saying we've gotten to this point, and I'm not saying the United States we couldn't end NATO today. I think we should have ended NATO in call it 1995. Walked away, been a helpful kind of offshore voice in helping to craft a new European security architecture that really would have included Russia and would not have been creating an adversarial dynamic that's partly gotten us to where we are now. And by the same token, had Russia gone whatever direction it had gone, we're in the realm of counterfactuals here, but had Russia, resolutely refused to take that kind of hand and had continued to see itself in opposition to the United States and to Europe, as it eventually ended up by the late 90s, certainly the mid 2000s, had it gone in that direction, a new European security architecture, I think, would have been a powerful way to help create and ensure credible European military power, which doesn't really exist right now. The NATO militaries I've seen one kind of good taxonomy divides them up into sort of workhorses, show ponies, and real free riders. And even the workhorses in NATO, if you want to put United Kingdom in that category, France to some degree, they spend less, but I think get more bang for their buck in a lot of ways. Dutch are pretty good. There's some of these countries that have very capable, but usually very small and underfunded militaries even there. That we have that arbitrary kind of 2% of GDP mark we see a lot. We can discuss whether that's, again, I think it's fairly arbitrary, but at least demonstrates some societal and government, willingness to fund their militaries to a certain level, and only a couple of NATO countries are clearing that. The Brits, two out of the three Baltic countries, and clearing it barely. So, all that being said, I think the United States get through this current crisis. Hopefully, it does not come to a war. If it does, I think it's pretty clear. The president has rightly said that the United States is not unilaterally going to intervene militarily in Ukraine and fight for a country that, again, despite all the talk of partnership and despite what Russia has done in the conflict in Ukraine's east for the better part of the last decade, despite all that, this is not a NATO ally. We could go into this if we like. We could have a discussion about the promises and then sort of leaving the door open for NATO membership to both Ukraine and Georgia. I think that's a bad idea, but that's where we currently sit. It doesn't look like we're walking away from that. But moving past this current crisis, we need to get, I think, as quickly as possible to a situation where the United States, to my mind, should maintain. There's some useful tactical infrastructure or even kind of operational infrastructure in terms of air bases, in terms of naval bases, things like that would be worth keeping. A few big hubs, but the United States should not be, especially now as we confront a rising China, as we have enormous fiscal problems and broader, governmental, if not societal problems back home. We can't really afford to maintain to defend Europe against Russia and to be what I think we need to be in the Pacific. There's a good report, a CNA report a little while back, that gets into that and demonstrates that a lot of the numbers that get thrown around on the Russian military and Russia's defense budget are artificially low. I mean, Russia is militarily pretty much autarkic in terms of it's producing almost all of its own gear. It gets a lot more bang for its buck manpower-wise than a lot of countries, partially by dint of using about a third conscripts to do a lot of the easier and less expeditionary jobs in its military. So, saying that Russia, doing the kind of GDP comparison, saying, the Russian economy is the size of Canada's or the size of Italy's, that doesn't do justice to either the real size of the Russian economy and certainly what it means in defense terms. All that being said, you can take I think my report has a graph in this on there. You can take basically Germany, France, Britain. Those countries have not only the economic might. Germany's economy really is about the size of Russia's, albeit much more diversified and better in a lot of ways. Those countries could absolutely afford to defend Europe on their own if they made the necessary commitment. So the capacity is there, but it's extremely stillborn. The United States needs to, I think, it's an overused word, but in a responsible way, find a way to largely get out of Europe, or certainly not make itself the guarantor of European security as it currently is. I don't think this is a tenable situation, and there's a whole other embedded kind of discussion about NATO and China, and I've written on that not too long ago, and plenty of other people have. But the idea we're going to now make NATO into a bulwark against China and these kind of farcical little freedom of navigation patrols by a lone German frigate or a couple of warships from another NATO country. NATO, if NATO exists as NATO, even with a U.S. presence, NATO should be defending Europe. The Europeans should ensure their own security from Russia and any other feasible adversary, to include all their problems in the Mediterranean and migration and counterterrorism. That should be where Europe should spend its defense dollar, its defense bucks, and its defense focus. And thus leave the United States free to look after its far bigger interests in Asia. I think NATO, there's the famous line, from now deceased Senator Lugar, I think back in the 90s, that if NATO didn't go out of area, it would go out of business. And we've watched NATO go out of area into Libya, into Afghanistan. And I think the reverse is true now. And I think there was a recent Swedish prime minister that said that, if NATO continues to go out of area, it's going to go out of business, because that creates further, it further waters down NATO defense of Europe, or European defense of Europe, and it creates more and more tensions in the alliance. Most of European NATO and most of Europe in general, I think, does not want to jump on American competition, let alone conflict with China. They would prefer to sit on the fence, and that's their right, and they can make the economic and security decisions commensurate with that. But I think we need to kind of draw down in Europe as expeditiously but responsibly as possible, and really, the much ballyhooed kind of pivot to the Pacific that hasn't really happened. That's where the United States' attention should be focused.
Sticking with Europe a second, a critic of your read of the balance in Europe might say, okay, the Europe as a whole is richer and more populous than Russia by a long shot. But none of the individual European countries meets that definition. And so could there be a big coordination problem or a buck passing problem where each major European player, like France, Germany, Britain, says, okay, we're going to let somebody else handle this. And we're going to, maybe try to work something out with the Russians and not fight them directly. Or some of these countries also, as you mentioned, they build either free rider militaries that are basically useless, or these kind of show militaries that have like one or two high-end capabilities that are really cool that they love to talk about, but then they actually don't really integrate that into a capable force. I mean, I think Germany is certainly seen as a country that not only doesn't spend enough on its military, but doesn't get a lot for what it spends. What do you make of some of these potential challenges of European defense? Because the primacist counter argument is that's why the United States needs to be in there providing security.
Yeah, I would question that in a couple of ways. One is just the practicality of it. We, for all of the insularity of foreign policy and American foreign policy, our country spans a continent. Most Americans from the founding to the present aren't particularly interested or engaged in foreign policy, and only kind of perk up when there's a real or purported kind of crisis in the wings, or especially when American troops are engaged. And even then, sometimes it takes longer than it should for the American people to pay attention. But leaving all that aside, you're putting that aside for a second. I think that what I would say is that if we get to this point, and Ukraine may be a salutary example there, the American people, I think, are clear, polling around this issue. They don't want Americans going to war in Ukraine for a non-ally to fight Russians. I mean, I think that's crystal clear. There's been, I think, Charles Koch Institute did a poll, obviously, and there have been other folks that have done that. Should, let's say we follow this, whatever happens in Ukraine happens, Europe remains militarily impotent. The Germans and others are wedded to Russian gas, and that's sort of the sword hanging over their necks there. And Britain and some of the more kind of hawkish countries towards Russia, so Scandinavian NATO members, the UK, Dutch to a degree, they are not able to kind of drive a consensus absent U.S. Thumb on the scale, U.S. intervention. They're not able to drive a consensus against Russia, and Russia sort of chips away, or salami slices, whatever you want to call that, and we find ourselves at the brink of war. I think it's a very open question whether the American people would endorse a war to fight Russia in the Baltics, to fight Russia in Poland, wherever else. We can never mind the fact that the NATO treaty, Article 5, is a little less than ironclad, and there are other ways out, and we could do a lot less than fight a war. But I think there would be nothing worse, a few things worse for American power than for a war in Europe to start, and the United States to basically forsake Europe under pressure, right? We would be much better served by a turnover of responsibilities, whatever that looks like, to the Europeans in large part, versus being confronted with a crisis and then not, writing, essentially, as some American political actors try to do now, writing checks that we're not going to cash. Are we really going to, leaving aside the kind of nuclear Holocaust scenarios and trading cities by missile and all the kind of Cold War stuff, are we really going to start a conventional war with Russia over the Baltics? I mean, we're in theory, we're pledged by treaty to do that. I'm not sure in the event of war that would happen. And there's a whole information operations and kind of propaganda discussion, all of that. We would be much better served, as I said, building whatever that European consensus on Russia is, building something like that is European driven, that has some real resilience, as opposed to where we are now, which I think is the worst of both worlds. I think the American people are increasingly unwilling to carry the buck for free riding allies, especially rich free riding allies like the Europeans. I mean, there's a much better case to be made for American military presence and American willingness to fight in the Pacific. Some of those allies are very wealthy too, but than there is in Europe. So I think in the event of hostilities, it would be an open question how this would play out. And in many ways, that would be the worst way this could go. So I think regardless of what happens in Ukraine, not a NATO member, I think it's pretty clear no NATO member is going to actually fight the Russians in Ukraine. There can be measures short of that, whatever those look like. And we've seen with the overflight stuff and the Germans that even that kind of support from some of the most important countries in the alliance is very questionable. So this may be a kind of powerful moment for a look in the mirror and finding a better way forward than what we have now.
And Gil, you mentioned the Pacific, and let's turn that way. And by the way, folks, for those of you listening or watching, we've got the Q&A feature running. Feel free to drop questions you have for Dr. Barndollar in the chat. But turning to the Pacific, China seems to be the most capable challenger that the United States has faced in quite a while. And there's been a lot of talk and angst in Washington about how the United States ought to address this. And, as you mentioned, the Global Posture Review by the Pentagon recently did suggest some minor increases in presence there, although one of those was in Korea, which is largely not in the China equation. But what would you recommend we do with regards to our force posture in East Asia?
Yeah, that's really kind of the trillion-dollar question here, and I think should be the question that should drive America's overseas military posture. No question about it. I'd say a couple things. I would say, again, I think competition with China. I think China is the foremost, security threat to the United States going forward. Leaving aside, there's a couple of obviously big, glaring transnational problems, climate change. We don't confront, waves of migration yet, the way that countries in Europe have that are major national security threats, but we could in the future. But leaving aside those couple of things that are not discrete kind of nation state challenges, China's far and away the only real competitor with the United States. Russia is a very different animal, an important regional actor, but China is the only country with both pretensions and in some cases real ability to challenge the United States across the world. And so all that being said, the military piece of that equation, I think the United States' focus needs to be on the Indo-Pacific. I think the United States, more important, in some ways almost as importantly, the United States' focus needs to be, America's focus needs to be on its Navy as a military instrument at the expense of the other services. The Navy with the Air Force may be a close second, and the land forces should be a very, very distant third and fourth. And there's some rhetoric about that, but we're nowhere near that in terms of budget share and the state of those military services. But all that being said, I think that the sort of kind of trying to imagine a future war, or what, God forbid it comes to that, but a war in the Pacific, what that would look like. I'm certainly not a skeptic at a minimum of just a bigger forward presence and just pushing more and more troops, airplanes, ships into the Western Pacific. I think this Chinese, the PLA rocket force is a very real game changer in conventional military terms. I think that the survivability of U.S. forces in especially big platforms and big bases in Asia is very much in question. We have kind of the Spanish Civil War problem where we're trying to imagine what future war looks like based on some very limited examples. You can try to pick and choose lessons from Ukraine, from that kind of slow, kind of frozen conflict. Mostly that's lower level kind of urban combat lessons. You can get some pieces about drones and air support and missiles from various Middle Eastern conflicts, from Syria, from Yemen, from places like that. But we haven't seen a major war in whatever it is now, almost 80 years. So a lot of this is simulation and war games and a lot of other attempts to imagine what the future would look like. Never mind the whole dilemma of how you keep a war between two nuclear armed superpowers below the threshold, not climb that escalatory ladder. So all that being said, I think there's an open question about survivability, and I think both kind of dispersion and digging in are part of that. Those are big questions. That's a diplomatic question in a lot of ways. What the extent to which some of these major partners that do host U.S. forces, be it the Japanese, be it the South Koreans, Australia, how much they're willing to let us use civilian airfields to disperse our forces in the event, if we're on the doorstep of hostilities, that kind of thing. But I think that the I think there's an open question, and there's some folks in the Pentagon, according to reporting, who are asking the same question with kind of a jaundiced eye. They're, CAPE, I think, and DARPA supposedly are both asking that question: how survivable are U.S. forces, especially naval and air forces, west of Guam? And they're still, the major Chinese conventional missiles can reach to Guam, but certainly you get west of there, and it becomes very dicey. And I'm not a believer, I guess, let's say, in piling in or in automatically putting U.S. Putting kind of existential stakes on Taiwan. I think on the face of it, the geography and the technology involved, it's kind of crazy that we would put substantial American forces 75 miles or so at its narrowest point from the Chinese mainland. I think that's a bad idea. I think the wisdom of fighting for Taiwan is very questionable. But I think fighting in close, and that kind of, Marine Corps is driving this concept of stand-in forces and close-in fight. I don't find that very persuasive. And I think we should be thinking, anytime we're potentially going to fight a major power, we should be thinking in terms of a long war, what that would look like. So to me, the idea of a short, limited war with China is a really potentially catastrophic illusion. I think that certainly should not be the guiding assumption winning a short war with China.
But yeah, and I think in a lot of history, the view that you can fight and win a short war tends to be correlated with actually getting into a war, and not necessarily with that war being short. But let's pivot over to the Middle East for a bit. Last year, we pulled our forces out of Afghanistan. There's been talk of drawing down some of the temporary defensive deployments with things like Patriot missile batteries that we had put out in the Gulf. Is that kind of small drawdown enough to have our footprint aligned with our national interests there?
Yeah, I don't believe so. Although it's encouraging, and I think that there's a lot of hand waving or even pearl clutching about America's role in the Middle East, and is the U.S. leaving the region, and I think we are kind of slowly but surely, and I think that's for the best. I think the greater Middle East and North Africa, and even if you want to throw parts of Central Asia into that equation, would be by and large better served by kind of benign neglect from the United States than by what we've been doing since the Cold War. I don't think our military footprint there reflects where America's attention and money and potentially lives should be spent. So yeah, I guess I would say traditionally you see supposedly vital U.S. interests and vital U.S. national interests in the region, kind of three silos. You've got obviously oil or hydrocarbons more broadly, and the free flow and the importance of the Middle East and really the GCC countries to the global economy by dint of oil and gas exports. You've got that piece, you've got the counterterrorism piece, and then you've got Israel and Israel's security. And I would say none of those things, and we can take them in reverse order, I guess, depend on a robust U.S. military presence, especially in the Persian Gulf. The Israelis can take care of themselves. They're in some ways ahead of us in some of these critical technologies. They are conventionally unchallenged and unchallengeable since you could put it at the demise of Saddam Hussein, but I'd go back even earlier than that. So the Israelis, despite the unconventional threats they face, most of those are going to have a political resolution, not a military one, in terms of Hamas and Hezbollah. And even there, they've shown repeatedly they have the ability to launch short, kind of sharp, punitive wars if they need to defend themselves from those kinds of threats. Counterterrorism. I think it's pretty clear now, 20 years after 9/11, that the war on terrorism, global war on terrorism, has been a disaster. I don't think there's another word for it. We've spent, the lowball estimate would be $6 trillion. It's probably 2, 3, 4 times that when you throw in interest and VA, medical costs and everything else. To say nothing of what it's done to America's attention or what it's done to American society and a body politic. I think that terrorism is nowhere near, and I hope no serious, credible person would dissent from this. Terrorism is not an existential threat to the United States. Even the continued wisdom, and we can get into this at more length if need be, the continued wisdom of even some of these small advisory deployments countering terrorism, I think, is open to question in a lot of cases. And then oil, I think really the world has changed. And you look at Middle East gas and oil, 2/3 of it, including Saudi oil, is going to Asia. That's going to both U.S. partners and to China. The United States is competitor, if not adversary. So to me, I get it. Global market is fungible, but to me, the United States' interest in terms of hydrocarbon flows out of the Persian Gulf should be about the ability to interdict, to shut that off. We always think in terms of Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz and could we force it open, and that kind of sort of tactical and operational question. I think we should be thinking about what if the United States wants to close that strait in the event of hostilities with China, or guarantee the flow of hydrocarbons to our allies. So I think the United States doesn't really need any substantial military presence within the Persian Gulf. Never mind the vulnerability of ships in those kind of narrow seas, and we've seen that play out in war games with Iran. Most famously in the Millennium Challenge exercise almost 20 years ago. And there's a back and forth on that. We don't have time to go into here, but I think a presence outside the Persian Gulf. I think moving, a colleague of mine, Mike Sweeney at Defense Parties, wrote a good report on this. You can find on our website. But moving the U.S. presence westward, kind of pulling away from the Gulf and doubling down or kind of keeping the existing footprint in places like Jordan and Turkey makes a lot of sense. To me, the naval hub, and if I was, starting from scratch, the naval hub that makes sense would be getting kind of a timeshare with the Brits in Duqm and having a naval presence. It doesn't need to be a very big naval presence, but kind of a refueling and logistics spot in Oman that has been a traditionally neutral country, but has also quietly kind of done a lot for us under the table, including the wake of September 11th. So that kind of posture and getting out of the Gulf, which has a host of problems, and I think is far less important to American security than it used to be. That would be kind of the axis I would want to engage on.
One other symptom or outcome of the expansive global footprint that we have is a very high operational tempo for the military. The forces being out, doing lots of missions, having short turnarounds between deployments and so forth. How does that relate to some of these issues around posture and strategy? What's the nature of that problem?
Yeah, I think it's huge. I think it really affects readiness and maybe to some extent credibility of American military force when we are clearly overworking, kind of grinding down a military, both in terms of materiel and more importantly in terms of manpower. This is as we like to remind ourselves and pat ourselves on the back. This is an all volunteer military, or maybe more accurately, an all recruited military, and constantly keeping people away from home and on a deployment cycle, despite being at peace. Call it what it is. I think the military. Yes, there are thankfully a small number of Americans in harm's way and limited kind of counterterrorism campaigns. But war in Iraq is over. The war in Afghanistan is over. And even if we caveat that with a tiny asterisk in Iraq, it's not what it was 10 or 15 years ago, obviously. So we have this military that is at peace, that is on operations, but certainly not at war, that is still grinding itself down through this constant demand of combatant commanders for forces. And we see this in maybe places we wouldn't necessarily expect. I think actually Special Operations Forces, some of the latest data out of congressional testimony from them is that they're in a healthier place as far as that dwell to deploy ratio we talk about. They're in a healthier place on the manpower side than they have been for most of the global war on terror. But certain units in particular, air defense artillery, the Patriots, the THAAD, those kind of really valuable assets as we're in the sort of missile age of warfare, maybe those assets, higher headquarters, kind of core headquarters, and then especially the Navy and the Navy carrier fleet we've seen in particular. People are always sort of demanding the kind of modern gunboat diplomacy of having a carrier offshore. Never mind the fact that I think we all acknowledge that the vulnerability of aircraft carriers in the event of a major war is a huge question, or maybe almost an answered question at this point. We would not. We're not going to, it's not the mid 90s. We're not going to cow the Chinese by sailing a carrier or a pair of carriers through the Taiwan Strait. That's just not, that's changed a lot. We would be, I think, very apprehensive about doing that. Same thing, you may notice when hostilities heat up with Iran, most of the time our carriers or even our amphibious ships are kind of cutting triangles in the Arabian Sea, a healthy distance away from Iran's coast. So, no question about it. I think the operational tempo and the refusal of both military and civilian leaders to say no has done real harm to both the long and short-term health of the force. And I think we need to kind of get back to a sustainable posture, especially as I said, in what is a time of peace.
So we've got a question from Lily Doninger, who says, well, I understand your point about the U.S. not needing to be responsible for European security. What does Russia potentially gaining territory and taking power over Ukraine and the Baltic states do for the United States? Is there not a strategic need for the United States to ensure that Russia doesn't further threaten American national security?
Yeah, no, a couple pieces on that. I mean, one, the Russians, and I will say this. I mean, again, I'm not a sort of a fan of NATO, or certainly not as it's presently constituted and what it does. But the Russians do, in their behavior, how they treat NATO members and how they treat Ukraine is very different, and that's sometimes taken as an argument to bring Ukraine into the fold. I'm against that for a host of reasons, and all of which we're sort of seeing right now. But I think that and I'm not saying just feed the Baltic states to Russia, and it's an open question of whether Russia would like to govern the Baltic states at all, or whether it's just another provocation and something they use as a lever. But I think that we have kind of existing. The geography is what it is. I think the Baltic states, and they should be saluted for this, need to make themselves a tough nut and make themselves indigestible to the Russians, and do basically what the Finns have done. Over decades, have made themselves a nation in arms, have introduced conscription, have kind of built a military predicated around what they can afford and what they can do to make it both a tough nut to swallow for the Russian military, although some of that at some point it's a math equation, but also ask the Russians, do you want to govern a fundamentally hostile population that is going to fight and bleed you in a small war over a long period of time? You've seen some of those arguments made about Ukraine, and some stuff that came out in the press recently about unconventional warfare training missions by CIA and by DoD. Zach Dorfman of Yahoo News had a piece on that recently. So yeah, I think that we need to be realistic, and we need to look at what we can do to prevent Russia from making these decisions. But I think if the Russians are going to invade Ukraine in force, going to, whether that's to topple the Ukrainian government, to teach them a lesson, to ensure to destroy as much of the Ukrainian military power as possible, we're not going to go to war over that. We're certainly not going to risk a nuclear war over that. And the question to me, the more important question, and we've said as much, right? The more important question to me is what we do going forward, and what this should mean for European countries facing Russia. The Russians are not 10 feet tall. Again, they spend a lot in the military. They have pretty good gear. They are light years past where they were in the mid 90s when their army was humiliated in Chechnya the first go around. This is not the force that went to Georgia, a little over a decade ago, and accomplished what it wanted to accomplish, but had a lot of hiccups on the way. This is a pretty credible big league military again that has fixed a lot of its problems. But the Russians, despite all that, this is not the old monstrous Red Army of the Cold War era, which had its own host of problems. I think it is well within the power of European NATO to build enough military capability and capacity to deter the Russians. No question about it. Yes, that would require some alignment on the severity of the Russian threat, and that's a bit of an open question, right? You have other European countries, especially countries along the Mediterranean, that are much more concerned. You see this from the Italians, from the French to a degree, that are much more openly more concerned about migration and counterterrorism issues than they are about Russia. Obviously, the Poles, the Baltic countries don't feel that way, rightly. So there's no easy answer here, but I think that I think it's interesting too. You look at what happened in the wake of the previous go around in Ukraine, right? The Crimean invasion in 2014. The two countries that, to my mind, took that really seriously and rearmed were the Finns and the Swedes, who are not NATO members. They may be after another Ukraine war. Sweden reintroduced conscription, spending a lot more on its military. I mean, the Finns just made a big decision. Kind of, again, it's Finland, so it's maybe not front and center on people's radar, but the Finns just did an F-35 buy for their own reasons. I don't think that's not actually really, to my mind, a show pony thing like a lot of expensive defense procurement is for a lot of countries. The Finns bought what was the equivalent, I don't have the number to hand, but it's essentially for the size of Finland for a country of 5 million people. That's equivalent to buying almost 2,000 F-35s. They made a huge buy, and they've also, wake of Crimea, they've done a lot to change alert statuses to make their mobilization, their conscript military more credible in the event of a sudden security crisis. So while the Germans kind of, huge heavyweight, 80 million person country with one of the biggest economies in the world, did next to nothing, the two smaller non-NATO countries really did rearm. And I think that's telling, and that's whether we see the rest of NATO or most of NATO, or certainly at least countries in Central Europe, take the Russian military threat more seriously after this. That's an open question.
So staying on that theme, Michaela Cooney asks, what do you see as the future of NATO? Does it have one? And if it continues to survive, what should Turkey's role be? Are there other countries that should be admitted? I mean, you mentioned the possibility that Finland and Sweden would be admitted. What do you think about all that?
Well, look, before this latest crisis, NATO, the 70th, whatever it was, a couple of years ago now, remember when the 70th anniversary of NATO, came and went, and there were just sort of, I guess, a sense of kind of ennui about NATO and in this kind of struggling, sort of purposeless. What is NATO? U.S. attention was already at that point. National defense strategy had come out, and it was already moving past counterterrorism, past Afghanistan to look front and center at the Pacific and at the challenge of China, and to a lesser extent Russia. So I've heard people say, NATO would kind of become like the Holy Roman Empire, would sort of just fade into this kind of political irrelevance. That may be a different animal, especially in the wake of if there is a major war in Ukraine in the days to come. But I certainly think that the Turkish piece is an interesting question. And when you talk about if we are going to get to some, even if it's not quite the level I want, but some real burden sharing in Europe, it's going to be hard to have that happen without the Turks. For all of their, they're a very difficult ally. They do some things we don't like, and are a bad actor, I would say, in chunks of the Middle East and Central Asia. They've been tough to get along with, and their government is whatever you want to call that, an illiberal democracy, kind of almost not quite a one-party state, but Erdogan is who he is. All that being said, it's hard to envision a European NATO that can stand on its own 2 feet without Turkey as a part of that equation, especially given the Black Sea ramifications of that, the size and capability of the Turkish military forces. Turkey as a kind of growing defense industry, and their drones have gotten a lot of deserved attention for some of the work they've done in campaigns in obviously the Armenia-Azerbaijan war, Libya, and now maybe a little bit overhyped, but they're Turkish TB2 drones with Ukrainian forces now. So I think the Turks have to be part of that equation, and their relations with Russia are very interesting, especially when you look at some of what happened in Syria and the back and forth in Libya, and the way the Turks have played some of that over the last few years. Sweden and Finland, again, I have a lot of respect for what those countries have done with their military, the seriousness with which they are now treating Russia as a threat to themselves and to Europe. Would they rush to join NATO in the event of a war? I'm not quite sure that's the case, but I think it's a more and more alive discussion in both countries, despite kind of some internal political opposition, especially in Sweden. I don't, in general, I would be more, if the Swedes and Finns come aboard, at least those are countries that take their security seriously, that are increasingly take their security seriously, are responding to the threat they see from Russia, and have some military both capability and capacity for a country for their size. I'm not a believer in expanding NATO. I think NATO should have been put to death, as I said 25 years ago, or quietly retired, maybe is a better way to put it, versus expanded. But the Swedes and Finns have a much more credible case to be part of a European security alliance or security infrastructure than North Macedonia or Montenegro or any of these, tiny countries that are obviously security clients. At the end of the day.
So we've got another question from Matthew Mai, a former Marcellus Policy Fellow here at the JQA Society, who asks about how the nuclear force and the nuclear posture fits into all this. Do you think the nuclear triad should be recalibrated to align with a more restrained force posture you've described? What would the role of nukes be in what you've laid out?
Yeah, that's a good question. Sort of a whole different realm, and I'm not a nuclear security guy. There's a whole whole realm of expertise there. But speaking broadly, I guess I would tell you, for whatever it's worth, I am. I think that as we sort of is kind of current running under this whole discussion tonight, the United States has more and more, even some very hawkish voices. Hal Brands had a piece the other day. The United States has enormous kind of global liabilities or commitments, and we are realizing that we can't afford all this. Or certainly, we're choosing not to afford all this. And I'd say we can play with some of that semantic maybe. But when you look at the nuclear piece, I mean, there's the U.S. and Russia, and then sort of everybody else, right? For all the kind of whatever you want to call that, maybe a freak out in some quarters about some Chinese silos in Western China and this and that. The Chinese can obliterate some American cities. We have many times their weight in terms of both missiles and warheads. That's not going to change anytime soon. So in terms of changing the triad, I'm skeptical about from the bit of it I know. I'm skeptical about the utility of or the need for another whole fleet of heavy stealth bombers that are going to be B-21s that are going to be tremendously expensive. That ship is starting to sail, and at some point, like the F-35, it will reach the point where it cannot be recalled, and we may already be there. I don't follow the programmatics of that too closely. The submarine fleet, that's a given. I mean, that's the most survivable and important piece of the triad to me. We're going to recapitalize. It's going to be very expensive. There's a secondary kind of conversation about whether the Navy should be footing the bill for that or whether that should be its own account. I think the Navy's going to lose that battle. I'm not sure they should. I think they kind of already have. But yeah, you keep the submarine force. It sounds like we're going to keep the bomber force. The ICBMs and that discussion about the land-based component. In theory, they're designed to suck up missiles and that whole scenario. I don't know that makes a tremendous amount of sense anymore. I certainly, to me, there's an argument about, do we need land-based ICBMs? I understand there's some capabilities that come with that. I don't think those are essential to American security, as far as I can tell. But I suspect looks like we are. There's a nuclear security review coming, I believe, this year. Another thing on the administration's plate. But I'd be very surprised, given what they've done to date and given kind of the tenor of these discussions, if we were to cut down to a bipod there or something. I think rightly or wrongly, I think we are going to keep the triad going forward.
Yeah, and I think there have been some preliminary signals from the administration that they might kill a few of the Trump weapons programs, and that's about the only big change. But we've got time for one more question from Lily Doninger, who asks about another country's global force posture. Should we be concerned about China's plans to establish a military base on the Atlantic in Equatorial Guinea?
I mean, I'm not super fussed about that kind of stuff. I think it's a little more long-term, kind of more interesting or more challenging or more concerning than the base in Djibouti that got everybody hyped up whenever that was established not that long ago. But look, I mean, one of the only places we have a huge and enduring lead over China in a critical, maybe the critical military technology is submarines, right? By all accounts, the Chinese have not crossed that line, despite both engineering and espionage, into having submarines, and especially nuclear attack submarines that are as quiet as ours. And even though I think in a lot of ways have taken our eye off the ball in terms of on anti-submarine warfare for long stretches of time, with another partially another kind of casualty of the GWAT, I think that expertise is being reestablished. We have some partners that probably smaller navies that probably do that better than we do. We can relearn those lessons. So yeah, I just look, China is by some accounts the biggest already, but certainly the second biggest economy in the world. They have a military that is kind of catching up to where they are economically, and is probably pulling ahead of us in a few technologies and drawing to parity in a lot of others. And that includes their Navy. They already have more vessels than we do. We tell ourselves we have more capability and certainly more tonnage, but the Chinese are going to, navies generally go abroad, not necessarily go abroad to fight, but are going to need bases if you have pretensions to being a global navy and not a a green water kind of, or even a sort of near a regional naval power. So I don't know. I mean, it's something to keep an eye on. It's a little bit, I guess, disquieting just because it's our Atlantic seaboard. But those kind of things to me are far less concerning than sort of Chinese advantages in ballistic missiles, especially in terms of the size of that missile force. What China would do in its own backyard is a lot more concerning to me than maybe some kind of limited basing or access rights over in far-flung parts of the world.
All right. Well, we've been speaking with Gil Barndollar of Defense Priorities. Thank you very much, Gil. Thank you to all of you for coming out. And please take a look in the chat at the opportunities we have coming up, the essay contest with National Interest Magazine, and several upcoming events. But thank you, everybody, and have a good night.